Hello, welcome back to Britannium Times Live. We have a good episode this week. I have a great guest, Father Thomas Soroka. I know he's a priest in the OCA up in Pennsylvania somewhere. I think Pittsburgh. I can't remember. Shame on me. I can't remember the name of his parish. But we are going to talk about the situation between the Patriarch of Moscow and the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. Roughly around this time last month, due to the conflict in Ukraine, not conflict, but there is, well, we have the canonical church in Ukraine and a schismatic group, or at least they are viewed as schismatic by the Russian church. And the Ecumenical Patriarch has made moves to grant autocephaly to this previously, or depending on who you talk to, schismatic group in Ukraine. Now you have two competing churches there. The one who has good relations with Russia, the Russian-affiliated Ukrainian church, and the new nationalist church that is apparently in communion with Constantinople. So the Patriarch of Moscow, new sheriff in town. Hello, new sheriff in town. Anyway, they excommunicated Constantinople. The rest of the Orthodox world, like I'm in Antiochian church, we're just kind of still in communion with both, but not really quite sure what the future holds with that. Anyway, we're bringing on Father Thomas Soroka of the OCA, which they received their autocephaly from Moscow back in the 70s, I believe. So we're going to bring him on, and we're going to just kind of chat about this for a little bit, and I'm sure maybe a few other things.
Hello.
Hello, Father Thomas.
How are you?
Good. I made a faux pas while I was talking about you. What is the name of your parish again?
St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas. Okay. Yeah, and that's in Pittsburgh, right?
It is. Yeah, right outside of downtown Pittsburgh.
Awesome. Are you you don't happen to be one of those sinful Steeler fans, are you?
Well, I mean, I will die a Steeler fan. So, and this year we're doing pretty well. We squeaked one out last Sunday, so that was pretty good.
I'm your arch enemy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
New England?
No. Your division foe.
Uh-oh.
The Baltimore Ravens. I'm here in Baltimore.
Well,
it is the best rivalry in the. I think it's the best rivalry.
it is.
So it's always intense. The games are fun.
Absolutely.
But I do think that I do disdain the Patriots a little more than I do. Like the Steelers, it's more of, to me, it's a respectful hate. But the Patriots, it's just like a seething, just rage.
Yeah, we do share our dislike of the Patriots, though.
Yeah, I think
the Cowboys are right down there for me.
I think I actually rooted for you guys last year in the playoffs against the Patriots.
Good. We need it.
Got some AFC North brotherhood going on.
Oh yeah.
So what? For those of watching live, if there's any sound issues, if you could just give me a tip as to who needs their volume up. So what in the world is going on? Can you just give a brief, I guess we'll start with a synopsis as to the overall situation and what's going on in Moscow and Constantinople?
Well, the incident is that need a little bit of context, but the president of Ukraine, really in an unprecedented move, petitioned the Patriarchate of Constantinople to grant autocephaly, to grant self-heading to the basically the schismatic groups in Ukraine. So there's two schismatic groups. There's one by a former Moscow Patriarchate bishop who fancies himself to be a patriarch right now, Patriarch Filaret of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kievan Patriarchate. And there's another small group called the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, headed by Metropolitan Makary. So those two groups are very nationalistic. They're very much aligned with the political interests of Ukraine. And they basically would be the inheritors of an autocephaly that would be granted by the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And what the problem is, of course, is that there is already a legitimate canonical church in Ukraine, and that is called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate. Now they are autonomous, they're fully autonomous, maximally autonomous, and they totally govern themselves. They ordain their own priests and bishops, and they are under Moscow, but that has been, of course, a historical fact that there is this connection historically in Ukraine. That is the cradle of Rus. That is really the Russian civilization that came out of there. And of course, history being what it is, they went forward, and Russia, Moscow, became the new center of Russia. And Ukraine eventually became its own nation, especially after communism fell. And so with that independence, that newfound independence they have, they want to be completely free of Russia. At least the western part of it wants to be completely free of Russia. So, there's a lot of moving parts to this particular problem, but because the Patriarchate of Constantinople is now recognizing these two schismatic churches, Moscow, of course, objected on many grounds. They objected because this was a church that was essentially anathematized by Moscow because it's headed by a former and deposed bishop of the Moscow Patriarchate, Filaret, and Patriarch of Constantinople just unilaterally recognized him again and restored him to the episcopacy. And so Moscow's objecting on those grounds. Moscow's objecting on the grounds of interfering in their territory. And unfortunately, this has been, brewing for years, if not decades. And when Constantinople made this announcement, Moscow then countered by severing Eucharistic communion with the entire Patriarchate of Constantinople. So that means that the Russian priests and bishops, as well as the laity, are not permitted to serve with the priests and go to the churches to receive communion in the churches of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Obviously in Russia, that doesn't make much of a difference. There are no churches there of the Patriarchate of Constantinople in Russia. But in America, that's a very big deal because of the jurisdictional situation that we find ourselves in, where you have churches from different jurisdictions right down the street. And these are our fellow Orthodox Christians. And so there is this severing of communion between the Russian church and the Ecumenical Patriarch.
You know what my favorite Greek word is?
What is that?
Schismatic. Just kidding. Just kidding. I
Well,
shouldn't say that live.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is that I think Constantinople knew this was coming, and they did it anyway. I don't think Moscow really had much of a choice, and I don't think they have much wiggle room in this because it sets a bad precedent.
Well, I remember it was maybe 2 months before it happened. Metropolitan Hilarion just came out and said, if they do this, we will do this. So, I mean, if they hadn't, they would have, I guess, been going against their word, the Russian church.
Right.
I wasn't aware of that second group. This is new to me. Because the one that's not much, I knew about Patriarch Philaret. I did not know about this other group.
Yeah, it's a smaller group. They've been around since the 1920s. So they broke off from the Moscow Patriarchate, and they've been around for a long time, and they've had a kind of a sordid history. They're not real large in Ukraine. By far, the largest church in Ukraine by number of parishes is the Moscow Patriarchate, is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They have about 10,000 parishes. However, the Kievan Patriarchate has less parishes, but they are claiming they have more adherents. Whether that's true or not, remains to be seen. But they certainly have a large following, especially for those who are ideologically aligned with Ukrainian independence, with breaking any ties with Russia, and aligning themselves to more Western ideals, Western ways, Western governments. Of course, the United States is actually deeply involved in this particular situation. There's no doubt about it. And so it just depends on, what way you want Ukraine to go, because Ukraine is kind of at the center of that East-West division. And Ukraine has always been at the center of that. Even historically, back when the first Uniate Council was held, the Council of Florence, the Metropolitan of Kiev, Isidore, in the 16th century was, deeply involved in that movement and wanted to unite with the Roman Catholics. So it's not a surprise that Ukraine is kind of in a tug of war between East and West.
I kind of want to get into that next. But Patriarch Philaret, what exactly is what led to his, I guess, dismissal from the Russian Orthodox Church?
Well, when communism fell, he called an assembly of all Ukrainian bishops in 1992. He was actually a bishop of the Moscow Patriarchate. He was the head. He was the Metropolitan of Kiev. And, he was the head of the Ukrainian church. And, there was something going on there where he really found an opportunity where he could lead a church, because there's somewhat of a backstory to it. And that is, he claims, I don't exactly know the history here, but when they were electing a new patriarch of Moscow, supposedly he was in the running and he was in the lead. He was like the leading candidate. And either he got the most votes or he got next to the most votes. And he ended up not getting, elected to the patriarch, the seat of the patriarch of Moscow. And I think there were some sour grapes there. When he went back to Ukraine, he saw an opportunity in 1992. He convened all the Ukrainian bishops. They requested, this council requested autocephaly, and the Moscow Patriarchate immediately retired him, which is kind of a way that, synods of bishops take care of errant bishops. They just retire them. So they retired him, and he decided, well, I'm just going to go do my own thing. And he started this Kievan Patriarchate, and he proclaimed himself to be the patriarch of it. And he wears the patriarchal kukul and, the whole thing. But, the reality is they're not canonical. They started their own church, even though they were validly ordained bishops. When you are under canonical sanction from another church or from your church, you can't go do your own thing. Just because you're a validly ordained bishop doesn't mean that you are permitted to go off and do your own thing. He did, and so this church is considered schismatic. It's a very serious issue. So, he's very old now. I think he's something like 92. He's very old, but he's very, very popular in the eyes of those who, again, want that political independence from Russia. It's a nationalistic movement, and he is, in a way, kind of the religious figurehead, and the President Poroshenko is playing right into it. He's working very hard with the Patriarch of Constantinople to grant this autocephaly. And he believes that this is one of the keys to their independence as a nation.
It's very strange. The dynamics are really weird.
It is weird, because imagine if the President of the United States went to Patriarch of Constantinople and said, hey, we want to give the American church autocephaly. It's kind of unprecedented. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. It's the largest religion there, but there's also a lot of unions. There's a lot of former Orthodox Christians that are now considered Greek Catholics. They are they serve in the Byzantine, the Orthodox way, but they are under the Pope. And there's a lot there in Ukraine also. And these groups, this Kievan Patriarchate and the Uniats, they actually serve together because it's a nationalistic movement. It is when you say you're forming a Ukrainian church, the emphasis is on Ukrainian in this case, not Orthodox. It's just Ukrainian. So it's hard to tell where this is going. There's a lot of political tension in it. There's a lot of political machinations in this whole sordid tale, but it's very real. And I think at face value, when people look at the situation and say, "Oh, these are just church people fighting," it's much, much, much deeper than that. The roots of this go out in 10 different directions. You're talking about the Catholic Orthodox split that plays into this, the Russian Ukrainian split, the East-West split, like United States versus Russia. This is all playing into this.
Yeah, and typically on the far right, people tend to acknowledge that what's happening in Russia is good, and they'll admire, or sometimes would admire, like Vladimir Putin and Russian politics in general. But these quote unquote far right groups that are supporting this national church movement in Ukraine, they view Russia as still Bolshevik, and they're going to bring about like the LGBTQ into Ukraine. And I'm like, well, the EU and the NATO isn't going to do that. It's really twisted.
Yeah, and I mean the whole moral implications aside, the West is importing everything. They're bringing in the whole sewer pipe into these Eastern countries. But I think the bigger issue is the economics and the military implications of this, because if the West gets a foothold in Ukraine, they can build military bases here. They can put missiles at the front door of Russia. That's a gold mine to the military complex, in the United States. And so there's a lot at stake for the United States to make sure this happens. If you go to the U.S. State Department website and you just Google like Ukraine, U.S. State Department autocephaly, there is actually a statement by the U.S. State Department supporting autocephaly for these groups. It's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. And, it's, again, unprecedented that the United States government would take a position on a church schism in Ukraine. I'd be willing to bet that 10 years ago, most people in the State Department didn't even know where Ukraine was. And now, all of a sudden, they're supporting autocephaly in Ukraine. So it's not about church. It's not about church politics. It's a much, much bigger struggle. And it's economic, and it's military, it's political. It's very much East versus West.
I know we already touched on the political influence. Is there any chance, I've heard rumor, I don't know the validity to this, that the Ecumenical Patriarch has been pressured into this position, possibly related to the money laundering from the New York Cathedral, Ground Zero?
Yeah, that would be really hard for me to comment on. That's a conspiracy theory at best. I'm sure there's a lot of different factors that weigh into this, and I don't really know about any money laundering or anything like that. Obviously, there was some situation with the money for that St. Nicholas Cathedral in the Greek Archdiocese, but whether that plays any role in this or not, I honestly, I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. And my personal opinion is I don't see the dots connecting there. That doesn't seem to make a connection for me. And the reason why is, the Greek Archdiocese has supporters that are very, very deep pockets. And, all of the reports that are coming out of the Greek Archdiocese, I think, they're trying their best to clean that up. They have had auditors in there. They've had professional groups in there. And I think it was misappropriation of funds. Again, I'm not really knowledgeable about it, but I don't think it was, as sinister as it sounds. It was overspending, moving money around, trying to, cover debts and things like that. And I don't think it was, some kind of criminal enterprise. That doesn't sound right to me.
So level-headed, Father Thomas.
Well, I want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I have friends in the Greek Archdiocese. I have, friends in actually very high places there. And, I know how they operate. I know their desire for the church to grow. I mean, they're in a good situation too, because you have very, very wealthy Greek business people that have made billions of dollars that can easily fund many things that the Greek Archdiocese needs. I think, there's probably going to be some time of healing that's going on there. There's probably been some broken trust. But I think, I think even though the numbers are pretty big there, the numbers are big because that building, that St. Nicholas building there in New York, that's a big project. So I just think they misappropriated some funds. Not a good thing. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I don't even know the details about it because it's more zeros than I can count. I wish I had to deal with money like that in my parish. We're rubbing two nickels together.
I'd be happy to have $10,000.
I would be very happy. And if any of your listeners has $10,000, we're putting up some new icons. So I'd be happy to put an icon up in your remembrance, and let me know. Contact me.
Are you having a like an iconographer do it on the walls, or?
Oh yeah.
Awesome.
We've been going through this for over 5 years now, and it's really been an amazing process. So we're doing everything from floor to ceiling. And it's a big deal because it was a big change for our parish, and it was the typical turn of the 20th century parish, made in that sort of Western Russian style, right? And it was aging. Our church is 104 years old. And
wow.
A lot of converts now, and younger people have pretty high standards. They want a nice church. We're in a pretty bad area. So it's an opportunity for us to kind of renew not only the purpose of our parish and the vision of our parish, but even the actual building. So we've done a lot of work on the interior. We've tried to work on the exterior. It's like a never-ending problem. And so right now, actually came just a couple days ago, Father Theodore Yarevich from Erie, from the Old Rite Church, Nativity Old Rite Church in Erie, renowned iconographer, did some amazing churches. And his daughter goes to our church, thankfully, and she, contacted him, and so he started working in our church about 3 or 4 years ago, and we'll keep him busy for the next at least 5 or 6 years. So we've done all the side walls, back walls. Now he's working on the arch over the iconostas this next month, and the interior of the altar. So really excited about it.
Glory to God. Well, back on the subject.
Sure.
So what do you feel the ecumenical patriarch's motivations were or are for his actions?
Obviously, motivations are very hard to judge. He has stated, and I think it's very noble, he wants unity. He wants there to be this unity between these two schismatic groups with the Russian Orthodox Church. Unfortunately, his solution doesn't really present that, right? It doesn't. Unity is more about relationships than it is just simply waving a magic wand over a church and saying you're canonical. Because you can say, well, this church is canonical, or these churches are canonical, and now you have these parallel jurisdictions. You have the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. You have what they're going to call, they're not going to be called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kievan Patriarchate. They're going to be called the Ukrainian, or the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. That's what they're called, or they're going to be called once others have the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And, that's not going to stop the war in Ukraine. In fact, it's probably just going to escalate. So, I think his motivations, and again, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, I think his motivations are good if he wants to bring schismatics into the church. But this is not how you need to do it. It has to be done very slowly, carefully, making sure that these churches are actually teaching Orthodox doctrine, that they are ordained properly, that their churches are appointed properly, because who knows what's going on there. I've seen some pictures of some of their churches. They have like Nazi symbols in the decorative border of the church. It's insanity. So, I'm not sure that he really knows what's going on there. And, others, the detractors of the Patriarchate of Constantinople would say that his motivations are to simply, have more churches, more presence in the world, to increase the number of people that are under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, because obviously the Church of Russia is the big dog. We're talking at least 50 to 70 million people, 600 bishops. So it's an enormous church. And the Patriarchate of Constantinople, if you leave out the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, there's not much left there. There's not much left. So, there are some that would claim, and I'm not claiming this, but there are some that would claim that the Patriarchate of Constantinople is just simply trying to, extend their reach into the world. But they would defend that by saying that, they have that prerogative. They have the prerogative to be over barbarian lands, right? That's the canon 20. The barbarian land. So it means any land outside of Constantinople, essentially. That's how they interpret it. So it's tough. Is this a turf war? Is this just about expansionism? I don't know. I really don't know. It kind of feels that way. But if he has real pastoral motivations to heal this, I think this is not the way to do it. I really don't. I would have rather he had worked through the Church of Russia to bring everybody together. It could be a slow process. Maybe take 10, 20, 30 years. That's how you heal schisms, not just by ukaz, not just by signing a paper.
What are some of the primary arguments that they've used? I know you kind of touched on the barbarian lands thing. What are some of the other arguments that you've seen them use to justify this?
Well, so, the history of the Russian church is pretty interesting because it started in Ukraine. It started in Kiev. So when you speak about ancient Russia, it's called Kievan Rus. And then the capital of Russia and the expanse of Russia, the Tsardom, moves north, expands north. And eventually the capital of Russia becomes Moscow. So Russia always considered this to be Kiev to be part of their empire, at least, until Ukraine was independent. And I think psychologically they probably still, these are very closely aligned ethnic people. So I would say that Constantinople says, look, we gave you Kievan Rus. We gave you the metropolis of Kiev. What happened was, in 1686, Patriarch Dionysius IV of Constantinople transferred, there's a document, the metropolis of Kievan Rus to the jurisdiction of the Church of Russia, Moscow Patriarchate. And so what they're saying is, their justification is, well, we're taking that back. We transferred it to you, but that was temporary. It was like 300 years, temporary, 350 years temporary. And we're taking that back, and it's no longer your own. So they're using that justification. They're saying that it was just temporary, even though it was over 300 years.
Wow.
And again, Russia has a long history in that area of the world. Russia, that again was part of ancient Russia. So all of the monasteries, especially the Kievan Caves Monastery, that's part of Russian history. And so this is why, unfortunately, the decision is very volatile, because it can break out, and already has broken out in some places, in violence. These people want to protect their churches, and they feel like the Patriarchate of Constantinople is kind of interloping on their territory, and the Ukrainian government is going to steal their churches. So it's a very, very serious situation. This is not just church politics.
And I believe Russia has made statements saying that they would defend the Russian churches and their people in Ukraine. So this has the potential to be a world conflict, really, if you think about a worst case scenario.
Yeah, that would definitely be the worst case scenario if there was some kind of military intervention. Obviously, there is the war in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. And, the Western media says that Russia is right there. Russia says, no, we're not. So who knows what the reality of that is. The fact is that in eastern Ukraine, just like in Crimea, most of those people are ethnic Russians. And Putin said that he was trying to protect the rights of ethnic Russians because they were being discriminated against. They weren't, the government in Ukraine, the pro-Western government, was going to create rules, and I think they did, that made it illegal to teach Russian in schools, right? There's a lot of these schools, especially in eastern Ukraine, a lot of stores and even the government, the way they were running was bilingual, Ukrainian and Russian. And in order to assert that, again, nationalistic element, they had to suppress the speaking of Russian. So, it's a really curious example. When Russia annexed Crimea, of course, Crimea was part of Russia until Stalin gave it to Ukraine in like the 50s. Crimea was always part of Russia. And what is fascinating, really think about it, is that Russia basically walked in the front door of Crimea and nobody batted an eye. The Western media, they couldn't believe it. Nobody sent troops, nobody did anything. And that's because 95% of the people in Crimea wanted to be under Russia. And the other 5% that didn't, they left. And that was the end of it. I mean, there was barely a shot fired when they went into Crimea. Now, eastern Ukraine, that's a much different story. And, you'll never get away with that in eastern Ukraine. So, God help the people there, because you're right, they will protect their churches and they'll protect their land. And, we can only pray that it does not turn into a multinational conflict like, God forbid, in Serbia. Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, which is that's the nightmare scenario where, this church conflict would kind of push that button, and then it would become a new Yugoslavia. It would just be horrible.
Yeah. In regards to the EPs, what you just discussed, back the reference to the 1686 thing, what argument does the Moscow Patriarchate, what do they refute that with?
Well, I think, basically it's just time. It's like, well, this has always been our territory, even before. And let's think about this. Even before 1686, this was all Rus, Kievan Rus, Russia. And so the technicality of it no longer being under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, that's kind of a natural evolution too. Eventually Russia got its own autocephaly. In fact, I think Russian autocephaly was proclaimed by itself 200 years before Constantinople ever even recognized it, which is pretty much the story of all autocephaly. It's always fairly painful, and it's very slow. So Russia would basically just say, yeah, this is our territory. It's always been our territory.
Weren't they basically cut off in a sense from like the Ottoman activities?
You mean Kievan Rus?
Yeah. The Russian Church was cut off from Constantinople because of the whole Ottoman Empire thing. Isn't that right?
Well, I mean, they were trying to go into Russia too, but I think there are politics involved here also, and that is when you think about in the right before the fall of Constantinople, right, 1453, right before that, you had the whole Council of Florence, and the Roman Catholics were holding military aid over the nose of Constantinople to say, hey, if you unite with us, we'll give you military aid and we'll help you fight, the last vestiges of whatever's left of Constantinople. We'll help you fight for them. And when they signed the papers saying yes, and it was actually, started by the Metropolitan of Kiev, Isidore. When they went back to Russia, Russia completely rejected it. Russia didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I think in the Russian psyche, there was always that sort of, in a way, like distrust about where is this going? Because yes, they weren't completely impervious. There were a lot of tribes that came through. But yeah, the Ottoman Turks obviously never took Moscow.
Thank goodness.
Yes.
Because some criticism that I've seen, and I know I mentioned, we know that the Russian Church basically put out an ultimatum: if you do this, we'll do that. But was the ceasing communion and ties, was that the only way to resolve this issue at this time? Could there have been maybe less harsh measures taken?
It's a really good question. I wish I could have been a fly in the wall in their war room. I think some of it is also just kind of the Russian psyche. It's the Russian way of doing things. I don't know. I ask this question myself because from a strategic standpoint, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, you just fired every bullet you had. Like, what else do you have? You don't have anything else. Once you break communion, it might be temporary, you pull it back. I don't know, do you anathematize Constantinople? I don't know where you go from there. And so, could they have done something less to make their point? Personally, it's hard for me to answer for Russia. But I think they were trying to show how strongly they felt about this. And it is possible they could have done something less, right? What that is, I don't know. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure because the Patriarch of Moscow did visit the Patriarch of Constantinople, I want to say in August or September. Basically, that was his last-ditch effort to avert this crisis. And obviously it did not work, but, did the Russian church have to go so far as to break communion? Maybe they were showing this is a very serious thing. When you admit schismatics unilaterally into the church that were anathematized by your church, this bishop was deposed by the Russian Orthodox Church. When you do that, you undo what they did. You're basically you're overstepping your bounds. There's the question of Orthodox polity here too. The claim by some is that Constantinople's sort of behaving in a kind of a papally pretentious way. That they're not only claiming that they are the first among equals, they're claiming they're the first without equal. And so maybe Russia was trying to assert by going this far of breaking communion to say, this is really serious. The next step is you're out. But I don't think they would get all the churches to agree to that. A lot of churches are disagreeing with Constantinople, though. They are really not happy that they did this. So I think there will be a council. A crystal ball would say, I think there's going to be a council, and I think it's going to be resolved.
That was my next question.
Yeah, I think so. I think everybody's going to walk away with something. But, I don't think you can turn back the clock here. I don't think that these schismatic churches are going to be on the outside looking in. I think it's going to be hard to say, well, we were just kidding. You're still schismatics. I think once the Ecumenical Patriarchate has done that, now you're going to have all the churches that have to deal with it. By the way, the Church of Poland just came out a couple days ago and said, we forbid any of our priests or bishops to serve with these schismatics, and they use that term. Even though the Patriarchate of Constantinople had said they're no longer schismatics, they are part of the Orthodox Church, Poland came out and said, nope, can't serve them.
Didn't Poland, that's interesting, because didn't Poland basically get their autocephaly the same way from Constantinople?
Poland, there's, each one of those churches, especially like the Eastern Bloc churches, they all have very sordid histories of their autocephalies. Another one would be Czech lands in Slovakia. At that time, when Moscow proclaimed autocephaly, it was Czechoslovakia, and that was like in the 20s or 30s. And then Constantinople proclaims autocephaly, decades after Russia does. It says, oh, we're going to give you autocephaly. And then there was even a back and forth just a few years ago. They wouldn't recognize the canonical leader. Constantinople wouldn't recognize him, and Rostislav, Metropolitan Rostislav. And the funny thing is, like Poland, the Church of the Czech lands, these are all really tiny churches. They're smaller than the OCA. So, why is Constantinople so interested in these Eastern Bloc churches? I think it's because they want to try to bring them into their sphere.
I guess we'll kind of wind down, but this could open up a rabbit trail. It seems to me that when the Pentarchy was established, that was established to meet an organizational need that was needed at that time. And it doesn't really seem to apply to our modern organizational needs as a church. Do you think this ecumenical council that may possibly meet could address that issue and maybe come up with some sort of new organization?
I don't think it'll be a new organization, but and I'm being very sincere here. I was speaking to somebody. I gave a talk on this at my church last Saturday, and what I said is, I think the biggest problem, it's not the organization. They can figure out, what does primate mean? What do the other churches relate to this primate? What does it mean that he's first among equals, et cetera, et cetera? They can figure this out. But they can't figure it out unless they actually meet on a regular basis. And I really mean that very sincerely. I am very big on relationships. The way that we've grown our parish is through relationships. It's not through programs. It's not through, whiz bang, whatever. It is through making relationships. It's one person to another, getting to know each other, making sure that you know who the person is next to you. That's how you grow a church. That's how you become mature in Christ. And I think the only way this is going to work is if there is relationships between these men. They are men. And, they need to meet together. There was obviously all kinds of problems when they had this council in Crete. Russia didn't show up. Bulgaria didn't show up. Antioch didn't show up. That's a problem. Now, I know there were problems about the rules, and it was like it was a tug of war to try to, jockey for position. But whatever those problems are, they need to work that out because they have to meet together. I truly think if Orthodox bishops met together regularly, once every 2 years, they had a big synod somewhere, And I'm not talking about an ecumenical council necessarily, but just to meet and get to know one another. I think there's a much better chance that these problems will be worked out. We are very grateful for our elder brothers and elder fathers in Christ in the old lands, the old Orthodox lands. But one thing they don't do very well is they don't meet with one another, and they're using techniques of letters and so forth that were used 500 years ago. That's not going to work in the age of Skype. In the age of Skype, they can meet together. They can get to know one another. And there's a fear there. I don't know what it is, but there's a fear for them to maybe lose influence. I just don't know what it is, but has to break down. Has to be able to, have relationships with one another, meet with one another, and then these things can be resolved. The other problem is getting the politics out of it. This Ukrainian situation, just to go back to that, it's just full of politics. When you have a government, Ukrainian government, that approaches the Patriarch of Constantinople and says, hey, we want autocephaly, red flags should go off everywhere. Like, that just doesn't happen. So what's the motivation? Why is a government approaching a church organization for autocephaly? And so this whole very sad tale of Ukraine just has so many different threads in it. And ultimately, if we want peace and unity in the Orthodox Church, we're going to have to get to know one another. We're going to have to, understand one another, work out our differences, so that we can be the witnesses to the truth about Christ, and not just kind of, being pointed to say, wow, look at them. They can't even sit in the same room together. It's very sad.
Well, that's all I have for you, Father Thomas. Thank you so much for coming on. That was a good, I guess it was very eye-opening.
Hey, it was fun.
Yeah, I think I have one last question for you.
Sure.
It's a shameless promotion. Have you had a chance to pick up a copy of The Bowl of Tears and Solace by Garth T. Ogle?
No.
Well, he's actually, it's his first book. He is an Orthodox author who goes to my parish.
Cool.
So I've been helping him kind of promote a little bit. It's a science fiction. It is available on saintsedwardmedia.com.
I will check that out.
Yeah.
I need some over Thanksgiving reading.
Yeah, it's good. It's not terribly long. It's about 207 pages. So
Nice, good. Well, we need creative thinkers and people that are writing different forms of art and science fiction, and I love that.
yeah,
So I think that's a great blessing.
we're trying to kind of counter some of those modernist assumptions that you find in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy works these days.
Yeah, it's kind of nihilistic,
Yep. So, well, thank you so much. Maybe we'll have you on again sometime in the future.
Sounds good. It was fun. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. See ya. All right. Well, that was a great show and a good interview with Father Thomas Soroka of St. Nicholas, I think he said, up in Pennsylvania, OCA. He is one of my favorite priests. He has podcasts and such on ancient faith. And Edith Humphrey, Professor Edith Humphrey, she goes to his parish, and she was on the show a couple of weeks ago. So pretty cool. Lots of little connections there. Hopefully, I have a chance to visit someday. Anyways, as you heard, if you haven't had a chance to pick this up, check The Bowl of Tears and Solace out on saintsedwardmedia.com. And if you like our content, please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, we would like to continue to improve the quality of our show. A lot of that comes from our patrons on Patreon, patreon.com/Britanniumtimes.com. We could really use your help. We'd like to continue to get better and put out a better product for you. Anyways, thank you for watching, and see you next week.